Welcome, everyone, to another very special episode of Legends and Lectures. I'm here with Professor Matt King to talk about something very near and dear to my heart, the history of goblins. I know now we have to cue like the Goblins and Gnomes theme song from Warcraft, I know, but we can't, so we'll just have to pretend that it happened. So, Matt, before we talk about the goblins, you're associate professor at the University of South Florida. Got your PhD from University of Minnesota in 2018. Oh, ciekawe gash you know. And but you specialize in medieval history, and so therefore, why goblins?
It's a great question and one that I don't have like a clear there wasn't a definitive moment where I decided this, but my background is in the history of the Crusades and the medieval Mediterranean, which is very fascinating but also just heavy and it can be really dark
Yeah,
talking
and
about.
that's where the goblins started. Yeah.
No, no, it was meant to be a break from that. I had finished my first book,
Hmm.
which is a very standard academic monograph based on my dissertation. And I needed to do something different. It was kind of COVID lockdown era. I couldn't go anywhere. And so I decided to do some digging on just the
You
topic
went
of,
goblin mode.
yeah, I mean, it's not inaccurate, right? But I decided to do something on a topic of more like personal interest. And I had read and just encountered some sources that get into the world of folklore, fairyland, and that sort of thing. And I was exploring the scholarship really cursorily, and I saw just a ton that was about fairies, a ton that was about elves. Uh, and in doing this, I was like, okay, but I know just from my own experience that the goblin is often interchanged or is often juxtaposed with these as like the evil component or like the underground component from like fantasy and fiction. And why aren't we getting as much about this creature that seems to be, like, in my mind at least, of equal importance, and there's just much less in the scholarship. And so I reached out to a few scholars who were very kind in just answering, an email from a stranger about goblins who said, "Oh, you might be onto something. Like there's more about this, and like fairy is a generic term, elf is a generic term, goblin is a generic term. But if they're all generic terms, I think we should at least consider all three at some point." And so I decided just to do a dive at this point. I did an article, and then I decided from that there was enough material to expand it into a book project, which is what it ended up being. And that is where I'm at with the project. And I depart from a lot of scholarship in terms of my methodology here, and this is something you've touched on in some of your interviews, where when we're talking about like folkloric creatures, we're talking about these creatures that just evade taxonomy, right? There's no
Yeah.
way to classify them because someone in the village over has a different idea, someone in the same family has a different idea about whether to call this creature that's in the woods an elf or a fairy or a goblin or a demon or all of the above or some of the above or none of the above. It's fundamentally like impossible. And so I decided, okay, we have these really great works of scholarship that already tackle the fairies broadly, in which goblin is a part of it. What
Hmm.
would happen if I just said, okay, I'm not messing with your taxonomies here. I'm not trying to say this classification applies to this creature or this creature. I'm not going to consider only, say, the solitary supernatural or something like that. I'm going to just look at the word itself. And so that was the basis of my study, is like the word goblin, some of its spelling derivations,
Hmm.
and how that word has changed throughout time. And it means most of the history is about creatures, like fictional or preternatural creatures that intersect kind of awkwardly with Christian tradition, and also like the abstract associations that can be levied at people, at ideas that are unfavorable. And so, in that, I try to just trace the history of this word from its folkloric origins, its demonological origins, and then into this world of fantasy, fictional media, internet culture, all of that. And so it's very broad in a way that's scary because I know that I'm so far out of my expertise for much of this book. But I also just think it's a history that should be considered in this breadth to understand the ways in which people have seen these creatures and also the word itself has changed across these centuries.
It's interesting how, as I said when we had a Professor Young here, when he was talking about, because he has the book, The History of Fairies, and you have The History of Goblins. It's amazing how close your books came out together, and I don't think you knew that he was doing a book on fairies. No, because he had already done three books on fairies, and then his History
Hmm.
of Fairies, he sort of just was like, "Oh, I have a book on fairies now." And I went, "Oh, okay." But it's interesting. I said the same thing with him. It's we today are very racist in that we say no, you're a goblin, you're a fairy, you're an orc, you're a demon. We have these extreme classifications for you're a kobold, extreme classifications for things where now we say no, this is exactly what this is, when really they're all just little dudes. They're all just little guys who who do who do similar things. And maybe they are good and maybe they are bad and maybe they're all fairies and maybe they're all elves and maybe they're all goblins. So what does the word goblin originally mean?
Well, so searching for an origin, like a singular Big Bang sort of point of origin for any folkloric term is pretty much always going to be like a fool's errand. There's no way we're going to pinpoint exactly when someone in France said the word goblin and people are like, oh, that's it. That's going to inspire Tolkien, you know? Like, um, instead, we have like hazy etymologies. And there's kind of two schools of thought. The one that the Oxford English Dictionary gives is that the Greek word kobalos is the ultimate word of origin. We don't know. Like it's so long before it's documented in the medieval sources that it's really speculative, and the OED admits this. And then there's another origin that it's Germanic from like the sort of German root word that gives us kobold, which later on is one of these like creatures that's kind of parallel or very similar to the goblin. I start the book in the Middle Ages with the Chronicle of Audric Vitalis, who gives this description of a demon named Zabulon that is vanquished by Saint Tyrannus in the city of Evreux in Normandy. It's northern France. And he just throws in at the end of this discussion of this saint who's now long dead that the like the spirit, the body of this demon remains in Evro. It's not powerful because it's been effectively destroyed by Saint Tyrannus, but it kind of stalks the streets, watching people as they are saved by God, and the commoners call it goblin. And so that's my point of origin. That's where we start in that 12th century context, and then that's in northern France, and then we move and spend most of our time in the British Isles, and then moving out to just the English speaking world, the Anglosphere, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. This is an admitted like shortcoming of the book, which is that because I'm looking at the word, I'm pretty restricted to the English language, to some extent French, though I do consider, for example, where like people are translating other texts into English. And so this is a real point of departure from like Francis's book, for example, where he's looking cross-culturally at all these creatures that are called different things in different languages. I'm saying, yeah, we're gonna stick to this one word and its many contexts. So it's a different kind of breadth than what we've seen, I think, in a lot of different texts that are somewhat thematically similar.
I think in general, when you're talking about goblins, you have to stay exactly because we're going to talk about what goblins are, what they became, but you do have to stay with the English and French speaking world because that's the word that the word evolves, and so does the creature, right? Nowadays, if you say something like Nissa, maybe the English speaking world doesn't know what a Nissa is or a Tomta. I mean, maybe they
Mhm.
do now because of Hilda, but Tomta, people might not know what that is. Is it a goblin? Is it a house spirit? People might know goblin, hobgoblin, hob if you speak English, but you don't know, or even if you speak French, but you might not know what any of the other, or elf, alpha, right? In the ecclesiastical history, you mention that the word is spelled with the G and not the K or
Mhm.
anything else, and then that it's not. We don't know if it's plural. We don't know if it's singular. We don't know exactly. And interestingly, Odoric says in that the common people call it goblin. So is this a thing? Because we talked previously about how fairies were acceptable in Christianity. They were a creation of the folk of the Pargus, right? And
Mhm.
so if they're a creation of the folk, it seems like it's the same thing with goblins, right? Because he says the common people call it goblin. What is that? Something the common people made up. That's what
Yeah.
we have.
And is it, I think in that one we know it's singular. We don't know if it's like a goblin, the goblin, is it capitalized, is it not capitalized? And this is like gets to some of the ambiguities in the medieval sources where it's like sometimes it's like a kind of demon, sometimes it's a named demon itself. It's also unclear because to some like demons are all just extensions of Satan, so it's one and the same, right?
Yeah.
And so it's yeah, it's part of this like contestation for like what is proper Christian practice. Here I'm borrowing from Richard Firth Green, who has a book called Elf Queens and Holy Friars. I think that's the title. Uh, but it's about how like the fairies are like part of this very real clash about what can exist within Christian conduct, especially in like the Central and later Middle Ages, as the church is becoming more powerful and people are pushing the boundaries. Because if you have a priest that is saying, "Oh, there's one Christ, and he's your Lord and Savior," and people are saying, "Okay, that's great," and also like, there's this elf that's in the forest, and that's not an issue for me. And there's like a great like excerpt from a Wycliffite sermon. It's kind of a proto-Protestant
Hmm.
movement in the 14th and 15th centuries, where this preacher is like, there are these lesser demons, and some of you call them elves and goblins, and they can't really do anything, but they might control the weather, and let's just move past it. Like essentially just trying to like avoid the topic entirely because it is just this preacher must have known that its congregants like were aware of these like this fairy world, right?
Hmm.
And didn't want to dismiss it outright, tried to shoehorn it into a Christian tradition, but said, what if we focused on Jesus instead? Right. And that's
Yeah,
like, I think just
I think I
so,
want to focus on Goblin. I think he
yeah,
sounds pretty cool if he can control
yeah.
the weather.
That was certainly my like that was my approach. Um, but it's yeah, no, it's just like it's these examples that we get from the Middle Ages are virtually all from monks. Um,
Hmm.
and they're all from monks who are their concern is sin and salvation. That's really like the core of their being. This is a world where like we probably shouldn't even speak of religion proper because it was just the world. There wasn't that separate category. And so we get our goblins and fairies and elves from mostly from these skeptics who are sometimes seeing them as like the embodiment of damnation. And there are
Yeah.
some definite exceptions there, but that's like from what I was working with, especially in like the 14th and 15th century sources.
And so let's talk about our first split, which is goblins versus kobolds.
Hmm.
Because where did that we know where the name where did that split in start to happen? And why are they so different now?
Well, I mean, Kobold is German, right? And
Hmm.
these are, to my knowledge, and this is where my own expertise is going to fall apart to some degree, since what I did was mostly focused on the British Isles, where like Kobold, typically a mine-based spirit
Hmm.
or a mine-based creature, similar to say like a Cornish knocker, or to some degree like the goblins of like Industrial Revolution pantomime, for example. Um, I don't have a clear point of origin where we see the departure of the two. What seems to me to be happening is that, in general, in the 19th century, we have a few things happening. We have folklorists who are trying to understand the origins of people and nations and ethnicities, and they see folklore as a way to do so. And in doing so, they're kind of saying, well, this creature means this, and it's similar to this creature, but it's distinct in this appearance. So we get comparisons between a lot of the creatures you were talking about, like the Nise and the kobold, the duende, all these different words are kind of grouped together, being like, well, this is kind of like a goblin, and but it's in this, Spanish context or what have you. This is combined with fairy tales and fiction surging in popularity, in which these folk tales, which had long been seen as like the domain of children and the ignorant women and nurses who were telling the stories to the children, they're written down and then expanded upon into longer and longer pieces until we get like book length novels a la George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin.
Hmm.
Um, and in those, we see niches being formed between the different kinds of creatures, whereas previously it was pretty common, especially as seen in like dictionary entries, to say, well, a goblin is an elf
Hmm.
is a hobgoblin, or something to that effect. But in these stories, we see increasingly fairies associated with lightness and goodness and positive transformation, often juxtaposed with goblins, which are in darkness, either underground or in mines. They're either antagonistic or just like gross and startling to whatever human encounters them. Like they're not always bad. In Dickens' Christmas stories, for example, goblins look terrifying, but they're ultimately helping the people at the end of the day.
Mm.
These misers. Uh, and in those sort of 19th century texts, we begin to really differentiate between the goblins, darkness, short, ugly, and fairies, light, good, benevolent. And that's like that was the first like big divide. And to return to your kobold question, in the English language, in like folklore texts of the 19th century, goblins and kobolds are often seen as like kind of similar creatures of corresponding cultures.
Hmm.
Um, but I get the divide honestly like really late is in terms of like D&D, right? Like something Gygax I think in like early editions made like a little differentiation between goblins and kobolds, but then in like the second and third editions, we see them kind of split apart in a way that I think informs my at least mental perception of them. I would say that's like a later split than say the goblin and the fairy and the elf, which is certainly crystallized by the time of Tolkien, who's I think is like singularly responsible for a lot of our own like mental visions of these things. Uh, but yeah, that's a very long answer to your question. I hope that's satisfying, but if you want to like
We
push
want to
back
make it
on
really
anything, please do.
satisfying. You just I'll just let me say that Victorians are nationalists and racist, and that Jacob Grimm has a lot to answer for because, as you say, he did write down a lot of both the Grimms write down a lot of stories that they took from women, and they messed with them and all that. But then of course our buddy Jacob Grimm was like, oh, this must be an ancient pagan something. You just go, you don't know that. You.
Right. With there's an autobi or not autobiography, a biography of the Brothers Grimm that came out last year, I think that I haven't gotten around to reading yet. But my understanding of the Brothers Grimm and a lot of these early folklorists is that they were constantly stealing from each other.
Hmm.
They like so like I think it's Thomas Crofton Croker and
Croker,
Thomas
yeah.
yeah, Croker and Neatley. Like there's some awkwardness with like lack of attribution. They're creating narratives based on what they see as like an idealized version of a story, often uncredited from women, right? They're who are often seen as the transmitters of these stories. And it's for the Grimm brothers, especially, it is just tied up in German nationalism. It's like
Hmm.
central to their project. And so, yeah, we're dealing with a society that is racist and racialist in the sense that there's categories of races and they're inclined to do certain things, and that is one of the origins or one of the ways in which the goblin is kind of moved outside of like its origins in Normandy and England, which is to like have some people compare or directly like classify the so-called the quote unquote pygmies of Central Africa, of like the Congo Basin essentially, as being the modern ancestors of the historical fairies.
Beowulf in general, which is very interesting because it says Jotun. This is the first time we have the word orc that's used,
Hmm.
right? Jotunus and Elfa and Orkneys, and that's what is accompanying Grendel. So would
Hmm.
you say Grendel is a goblin, or would you say he's an elf or an orc? What would you say?
At this point, I'm more or less willing to let anyone be a goblin or anything be a goblin who wants to be. Like I'm just I'm like swearing off definitions because it's just so fraught with. So when you bring up Beowulf, it's hard for me not to think of Tolkien because
Hmm.
Tolkien's the one who, you know, has created the modern orc. It's likely the word, comes from Beowulf, which he translated earlier in his career. And so this was more or less a chapter in the book is looking at Tolkien and the goblins therein. This is this is a tricky process because there's a mountainous corpus of work on Tolkien, and some of it's vitriolic. There are some very passionate people writing about Tolkien, and I wanted to do justice to the author and the world he lives in, as well as like the texts themselves. The biggest kind of piece that I like tried to emphasize when writing about Tolkien is that, uh, you know, Tolkien's Middle-earth evolved with the man who was writing it. And when he wrote The Hobbit, he was writing children's story primarily for his own children. He did not have a sense of the world that Middle-earth was going to become, at least in its entirety. He was already writing parts that would eventually become the posthumous Silmarillion, but he was writing the story, and it was in the tradition of certain fairy tales and fictional tales. He admitted George MacDonald is a prime inspiration for him, even though he
Hmm.
doesn't like MacDonald later. He kind of like sours on him. Uh, and so in The Hobbit, we have these goblins that sing in a way that is kind of raucous and profane. Uh, they are living beneath the mines, as we see in a lot of 19th century literature. Uh, and they are slaughtered en masse in a way that makes them, our protagonists, cackle with glee afterwards. This is a very different kind of creature, seemingly, than the orcs that we later encounter in The Lord of the Rings, published, much later. But in editions of The Hobbit, Tolkien says that they're the same thing. It's just a different language within Middle Earth. And so this will likely be controversial to Tolkien people. When I wrote about goblins in like the Tolkien corpus, I said, well, orcs are goblins according to Tolkien, and so we should consider them as such, while also bearing in mind that this is an evolving corpus. So tying it back to Beowulf, like yes, we bring in Grendel with the Orkneas. Tolkien saw it as a goblin. It's sure. Why don't we call it that? But in the context of Tolkien, I think what we have broadly is this just like creation of an orc or a goblin other that you can interpret as either a kind of dark-skinned non-European or a kind of uh, Catholic allegorical force of evil. It really depends on how you want to read Middle Earth. Is it as
Well,
an
consider and
allegory?
you say that because
Yeah.
I don't know if people know, but the professor Tolkien, he was Catholic, and
Oh
he
yeah,
and
very
very
much
deeply
so.
so. And so I
Yeah.
always take it as the second reading, because he's not too clear. He's pretty vague on what they look like. It's really the artistic representations
Hmm.
later on that come of his work that shaped how they look. And
Yeah.
they are thinking people. They are talking. They, as you say, they do sing. They have their own societies. So they're not necessarily all that bad, are they? But
Well, it's they are like this is where it's okay. So yeah, Catholicism, yes. I mean, Tolkien is not as like shove it down your throat as C.S. Lewis is, right? Who was one of his writing partners, but he
okay.
does, yeah, right. But he said that like this is like Middle Earth is about Catholicism to that effect essentially, and scholars have written about like okay, do goblins have souls? Do these orcs have souls? Are they uh created by loving orc parents? Or are they bred by evil? And Tolkien isn't very clear in this. There's contradictory information within his own corpus, and so it's unclear. What I would say is that there's an interesting juxtaposition between George MacDonald, who was kind of the biggest inspiration for the goblins of Tolkien, and Tolkien himself, which is that George MacDonald was writing kind of with the theory of evolution in mind. And
Mm.
so he saw the goblins as being devolved humans whose appearance and behaviors matched their circumstances once they moved underground. They became shorter and dark-skinned and
Like the Morlocks.
clever.
Yeah.
Like what?
Like the Morlocks from
Yeah,
from the
yeah,
Time Machine.
Star. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. And after like most of them are destroyed, some of them are driven out of their mountainous abodes, and then they kind of re-evolve to become milder and better. So there's like a weird like path for redemption in this particular like Victorian era tale. Whereas in Tolkien, I don't know there's a redeemed orc ever, right? Like they're just bad, right? Like they are
And that's where
agents of
that's where
evil
D&D originally got that whole idea of like
for
tor of
sure.
orcs are bad and you can't be them. They're considered to be monsters. Now it's a little bit different, but
Yeah,
I think
and that reappraisal I think is worth talking about at some point. But yeah, with Tolkien, we just have this like faceless evil called a goblin or an orc that is meant to be slaughtered, it corrupts things around it, like the some of the animals that they use. And so it's just this it's and it has this troubling just kind of like optic to it to us today where it's like we have these short dark-skinned inherently evil creatures being obliterated eventually by the tall fair often blonde like heroes, right? And whether you consider that a Catholic allegory or just like Tolkien's racialist framing of a fantasy world that he took very seriously, I mean it maps onto the racialist framing of the world that many were kind of espousing in the early 20th century. And this is should also go to say that like Tolkien disavowed like any like ideology of like say Nazism or anything like that.
Yeah,
It
and
seemed like his own
he also was very clear about the fact that he hated metaphor a lot.
yeah.
So
Yeah, and it's hard. Like he wrote so much, he said so much, and I'm just talking about like a subsection of his greater corpus. I think what is arguably like the more important part of this is that like Tolkien created this like world in which there were lots of goblins and lots of orcs, whether you consider them the same, and boy, are they easy to kill if you're heroes. And that's what these American dudes in the 70s latched onto, like Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin and this whole group that is responsible for the original editions of Dungeons and Dragons. They saw Tolkien's world, they mapped it onto their wargaming system, and that's where we kind of get, I think, our more kind of differentiated, stylized, taxonomized uh, creatures that are, until recently, the objects of uh, destruction for gold and experience and stories.
now they're the object of love.
They're the object of misunderstood
Yes.
stereotyping often. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So you talk a lot in your book about fake goblins. You have a whole chapter about it. Can you tell us what you mean by fake goblins?
So this is where, if I'm remembering this section correctly, this is where it's people of the early modern era who are essentially saying these goblins aren't real, guys. Right? Like so there is a phenomenon that has been dubbed by Barbara Rietti the perpetual recession of the fairies. Really like that term because it's essentially saying that since the time of Chaucer, people have been saying the fairies are going away and no one believes in them anymore and they're just at the margins and we're driving them away through either like industrialization or Christianity or the railroads or the internet, what have you. Uh, this ironically, like the continued griping about the disappearance of the fairies just testifies that they continue to exist. So it's undermines itself. Um, but in the early modern period, we have this whole corpus of mostly male urban elites who just let us know over and over again that goblins are not real, and they are certain of this, and that it is only the realm of the uneducated, often gendered in a way that like casts aspersions on nurses and maids and mothers who impart these uh, terrifying tales onto children to scare them into obedience. And thus, it's perpetuated into a new generation of people who don't have the enlightened cities and education that these authors have. And that's something we see for much of this history. And I don't think it really is ended because people still believe in the existence of these preternatural creatures. But there's all sorts of ways in which the goblin is used as kind of like a metaphor for this ignorance or a representation of this ignorance. And so we have talks of like people who are suffering from seizures have hobgoblin hallucinations and things like that. We Goblins and ghosts is a common pairing for these stories that are not real. And so the goblin is thus like is evoked in order to show something that is superstitious and backward and not real, but it carries all this baggage of spookiness and darkness that is that relates to some of the other kind of ideas that we've been talking about.
So let's talk about the three biggest offenders. We already mentioned the man I'd love to punch, Sir Jacob Grimm, and we touched very very briefly on Thomas Keightley.
Mhm.
But what about Sir Walter Scott? And I think a lot of people who study Celtic history, I think they have several bones to pick with Walter Scott. But
Yeah,
but
yeah, I'm sure.
what is his biggest offense in terms of goblins?
Well, I'm not looking to condemn people at this point. I think if we're looking at kind of like the way in which Walter Scott thought about the world, is that like he's Scottish and he's living during, it's not that he is Scottish. That's not an offense in and of itself. Apologies to any Scots who are out there. But he wanted to differentiate his modern contemporary Scottish world with the English who were ascendant at this point and putting the Scots culturally, politically on the back foot. And it seems that Scott used folklore as a way of differentiating the Scottish people from their brethren to the south. And so he tries to uh, kind of differentiate, the some of these Scottish folklore traditions with the English, which he kind of cheekily says are kind of, early modern Shakespearean, Miltonian creations, and not the same as the aged, ancient traditions of the Scots. And this was a common critique of England, was that it was a place without folklore, and it had really just been kind of had traditions imported upon it, and then they are popularized by Shakespeare, especially, and thus there's this fairy milieu. This is not true, right?
No, of
Like
course
there's
not.
it's definitely not true, but it was a response to very real political circumstances at the time.
Hmm.
So on the one hand, you have Scots minstrelsy, the Scottish border, which is looking to document these traditions. The English catch a lot of flack in that. And then you have his historical fiction works, or just his works of fiction generally, in which we see like echoes of that folklore, but really the goblin there is kind of like a marker of the supernatural and of horrors. There's, people that have atypical or grotesque characteristics. Here in Scott's time had less of a negative connotation. They are sometimes classed as goblins or hobgoblins. And you have in discussions of these like haunted castles and stuff, we have, the goblin as like a representative of that kind of spookiness.
Hmm.
This is in this, Scott's a little post-Gothic, but or he's after like the main like thrust of it, but he's like informed by that tradition. So I'm not trying to like pick bones with too many people here, especially because I'm like really cognizant that my own training is on like medieval Mediterranean, like political and religious history, and that we're in a few centuries like removed from that, and in a literary tradition that I do my best to navigate, but is definitely not something that I've spent the hundreds of hours required to like really know these texts. And that was something that was like really it was just a task in this book. Whereas when I was looking at the bibliography of the whole thing, it's just these hundreds and hundreds of sources in which I'm able to skim them, get a sense of them, and to pick out really the way in which goblins feature in them or are used in them. But my understanding of them is really, for most of them, it really feels surface level. And so when I think about this work, it really feels like it has the expanse of an ocean, but the depth of a pond, in that I'm really just kind of like plucking from all these sources. Like it's more sources than I've ever used in a work easily. And I don't do any of them justice, which is hard, but it's just like that's the nature of doing such a broad history. And it certainly opens me up to critique. And I think there will be good critiques to come from this.
But that's a
Um,
wonderful critique of Sir Walter Scott, which is he looks deep, but he's actually quite shallow. And so it's the same thing I would say with Jacob Grimm and Thomas Keightley and a lot, maybe to a less extent, Thomas Crofton Croker. But
mhm,
where you had a lot of these people who were, as you were saying, were taking fairy tales and creating more of a tight nationalist narrative. Like, no, these are our creatures. Those are your creatures. Those are
mhm.
what your creatures do. These are what our creatures do. And then people taking this as ancient gospel. And so we could talk a lot about the crap that Jacob Grimm made up or that Sir Walter Scott made up about what he thought was like ancient Celtic customs. You just go, oh no, he ruined everything. And so that's something I could tell you
Yeah.
about and all the stuff that he made up. But how let's talk about the King of Kings, which is George MacDonald's Princess and the Goblin.
Okay.
How what t tell us about how that affected what is the goblin there and how did that change the perception of the goblin?
I think in like researching this, when I hit the 19th century, I'm on firmer like literary footing in terms of what I understand. I've read Dickens and that's that sort of thing, so I kind of understood the corpus a bit more, and I was starting to see things that were more reflective of like the goblins I'd grown up with. And I didn't write this history trying to be teleological. I wasn't trying to be like, how do we reach young Matt's idea of what a goblin is, or
Well,
how
no,
do we
wait a minute, wait a
reach?
minute. Goblins that you grew up with in your house?
No, 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 no. Just like, well, I guess in the pages of The Hobbit, I
Oh,
guess we could classify. No, it wasn't, just
tell me
the
about the goblin under your bed. I'd love to
just
know
the
that.
hobgoblin of low self-esteem. I don't know. But like like in the early 19th century, we start to see like in pantomimes, we have the good fairies and the bad
Hmm.
goblin, stories in newspapers that are juxtaposing the two. And then when I read The Princess and the Goblin, and we see these creatures in a fully formed underground kingdom, a goblin king and queen and prince, they're trying to kidnap the above ground human princess to create a goblin family, the details of which are very unexplored in this tale, primarily intended for children. This is one of the things with Tolkien too. He said he was uncomfortable writing women, and so are there goblin women? Like we don't. It's kind of unclear, right? Like, uh, but in McDonald, we have like a fully formed underground goblin kingdom of these scheming miners who try to disrupt humans. I'm like, okay, well, this is it. This is like a very important nodal point for understanding like where goblins went in the world of fantasy. And McDonald was enmeshed in folkloric traditions growing up. And I talk a little bit about how he had, like an uncle who was uh, part of like Ossian and that whole controversy. Um, but in general, he like had this whole like milieu to draw upon. He chose the goblin as the villainous creature for this story to be juxtaposed with the humans above ground and the great great grandmother, however many greats of Princess Irene, who's kind of takes on like a fairy godmother-esque role. And from that, we have like the like I think it's hard to say foundational because MacDonald was drawing on earlier fairy tales as well. But in terms of like scope and importance, I would say it's not like wrong to call it foundational.
Hmm.
This like very important uh uh permission structure for goblins to exist in these kingdoms underground and have them be slaughtered by protagonists. And that, to me at least, kind of defines their role in a lot of fantasy and fiction for the next hundred-ish years.
It's interesting
Um,
that you mentioned that because it was soon, even in Tolkien, we start to have this differentiation between the goblin and the hobbit, right? Hob was a type, or a hobgoblin, a type of goblin, but not for Tolkien, right? He said the hobbits are more like gnomes, or what we would consider to be good gnomes or
mhm.
nisses, and the goblins are a lower level of orc in their orky society, where they've got goblins, orcs, and then Uruk-hai, right? But it's interesting to see how later on, now goblins have their own sort of society. So for example, we have this question of when did goblins, modern goblins, get associated with treasure? And you think of things like the treasure goblin in Diablo or like goblins in Warcraft. It's interesting that in something like Warcraft, you have goblins and gnomes have this alliance, at least in vanilla they did, where they have this alliance where they run the banks, they have a
Mhm.
neutral auction house, but they're two sides of the, sorry for the pun, two sides of the same coin, where they are together in this kind of enterprise, this gold enterprise. But goblins didn't really get associated with treasure or gold uh until, like you say, until around Sir Walter Scott's time. Where does that whole idea come from? Because we also have fairies doing like sneaky things, but gold is seems, or like treasure seems to be a very goblin-y kind of thing. Where does that come from?
I don't have a satisfying answer for you. I'll just say it at the outset. I mean, we have like, ugh, I don't know the exact like when I think about goblins and treasure, the like the world that's brought up for me is more recent than what you say with Walter Scott, which is like Gary Gygax and like D&D, where we have these goblins that raid, and the raid brings them treasure, and then the treasure is reclaimed by heroes, right? Um, we have much earlier accounts where preternatural creatures are, active in trying to like lead astray people with the promise of treasure. And there was one like Victorian era newspaper story I encountered recently where a goblin was like promising a coin to someone if he like chopped down a tree or a treasure, and it turns into just this moralizing story about the perils of wanting too much money. I don't have a point of origin there for you. You're right to say that like fairies are associated with this too. In the early modern period, we have these great like there's like a court case of this person who was trying to scam or truly believe that he could commune with the fairies and was uh promised this couple that if they gave him money, he would give that money to the fairies and the fairies would like transmute it into more money essentially. And so he had this whole setup. And so I don't know when the exact sort of like trope of the goblins with treasure comes by. Um, I see it in its like current form as being originated with primarily Gygax. When I think about like Tolkien and MacDonald, they're not really like hoarding treasure. They're living underground and they have lots of crappy weapons and like they're kind of living like they're not living the high life for the most part. Um and in D&D they might have like taken a bunch of good stuff from above ground people. And I'm probably off base to some degree there. But I see a later point of origin for like our current association with that. Even if there are all these like folkloric and fictional like precedents from the 18th and 19th centuries.
So you have a chapter at the end of your book, or rather, I should say a question, because it does come after which is when did goblins become green? And we talked a little bit about this when orcs, like when did orcs become green? And I think actually it's around the same time that goblins became greens. Can you tell us a little bit about when you found that goblins became green?
Well, the surprise, like, when I think of a goblin, a little green creature is the first thing that comes to my mind. And I really don't like generative AI. One of the only uses for it that I found that was actually interesting was to put, you know, a goblin, like show me a picture of a goblin into a bunch of LLMs. Uniformly, they return a small little green creature, usually in a forest or a cave. It's really uniform in a way that I wasn't necessarily expecting. And so that led me down a bit of a teleological rabbit hole in which I spend like so much time in the book talking about goblins and darkness. That's the association, is that they're leading people into darkness as in like a path at the end of the woods, or they're leading them into metaphorical darkness like sin, or they are physically dark-skinned, as in like black or brown. Um, but then we have this like greenness that is so overwhelmingly associated with goblins today that I thought was worth teasing out. And I did in the conclusion because I just felt like I needed to go broad with it, and the conclusion felt like the right place for it. But effectively, there is an association of goblins and fairies with green that stretches back centuries and centuries. And there is this idea of the green goblin from Edith Blyton's work. But here the goblins are clad in green clothes, which is a common trope for
Hmm.
fairies generally. And then at some point in mid-century, we see uh, goblins increasingly green. I think it's due to some artistic interpretations of Tolkien. Stan Lee's Green Goblin certainly is part of it, where the Green Goblin is admittedly just a dude in a green suit,
Yeah.
but the suit has a green skin tone. And those like depictions, I think, really catch on with like the Warhammer universe where we have like green armies. There's a practical kind of need for this on a tabletop. It's nice if there's like color differentiation for when you're looking at all of these things. And that moved its way into these video game universes where, say, in something like World of Warcraft, the Green Goblin is the default skin tone. And so
Hmm.
I see that like kind of mid 20th centuries being a kind of inflection point for that. Um, Even though I want to acknowledge that like there's no one way a goblin looks or ought to look.
No.
And in D&D, they're typically not green. Gygax said that they were, like grayish and reddish and yellow more than anything. Uh, and so that greenness feels to me like something established in the middle of the 20th century and not some timeless trope.
Yeah, at least in terms of orcs, the goblins' cousins now. It's the
Yeah.
same thing where actually it was in the 1970s where people started painting them. Artists started showing depictions
Hmm.
of war with specifically things like Warhammer. We started showing depictions of orcs and goblins having green skins, and of course then they became the green skins, and that's how it is. But it's not. It does, as you say, it's not bad. Doesn't mean anything.
It no, for sure. And it's interesting you mentioned like orcs is the cousins of goblins. That was one of the like interesting like when we're talking about like tabletop stuff. Like in D&D, orcs are kind of cut out from the goblinoid family early
Okay.
on. And so within the last few editions, the core triad of the goblinoids are goblins, hobgoblins, and bugbears. Um, and in looking at pretty early English dictionaries, I see that grouping with some degree of frequency. And orcs are kind of removed as this like separate entity. Um, but
Hobbs
again, you know,
too. Hobbs too. I mean,
oh yeah,
Hobbs are not in Warcraft, but Hobbs in Fable are
oh
are
yeah.
yeah, and they're not green in Fable, but they have their own classification as children who were secreted away, and they're kind of like evil changelings. So they actually fit more of the fa what we would think of as the fairy sort of aspect. But then they have evil
Mhm,
gnomes in Fable who are green and they shoot you with
mhm.
things and they have Glaswegian accents and they yell swears at you, which is great. I
And
love
it's one of the things about like this kind of general like neo-medieval fantasy world that we have. There's such established creature names and tropes associated with them. And they've been around for so long at this point that it's really great to see developers and authors and artists kind of moving away from these, I think, kind of tired associations. And so with goblins especially, it was striking to see in the last 20 years how this like inherent evil of the goblins, which for so long was just like, you know, they're gonna mess with people and they might be evil, they might just be mischievous. In, you know, Tolkien and D&D, they're likely to be slaughtered. Um, but now it's like you know, maybe they weren't so bad after all. Like
it.
maybe these creatures living on the margins of society and just like kind of occasionally interacting with humans, maybe they're not like so ugly and different and awful afterwards. Maybe the real monsters are us. This is like the foundation of a lot of like changes in how we frame monsters. I think Shrek and ogres is a great idea, is a great like example of
Listen,
that.
Shrek is a good husband, okay? The man has property. He takes care of his kids. He loves his wife for who she is. Shrek
Mhm.
is ultimate hero for sure.
Shrek, yes, Shrek is a hero, and he is kind of like an embodiment of these shifting like tropes associated with monsters, where ogres were always the bad, hideous, ugly creatures, and here we see, well, maybe that's not the case. And the same is true with goblins. This is pretty explicitly true in like later editions of D&D, which are kind of moving away from some of these Tolkienian archetypes and instead going back to goblins as these creatures of like the Feywild that are more mischievous and tenacious than they are like inherently evil. And that was one of the cooler um tropes to write about in going through some of these like recent children's books, for example, like Nobody Likes a Goblin, which is, you know, takes the trope of the marauding adventurer and just turns it on its head, where it's like the goblins are being transgressed upon by these annoying people. Or there's a goblin on the Ark, which is like a Noah's Ark re-envisioning that is meant to like
It's
show
great.
trans inclusivity, right? You know, exactly. And like the goblins are in that are admittedly like different looking and different in characteristics than the human thing. It's just a way to talk about the harms of stereotyping others. And so that was a like wonderful thing to just like encounter. It's very far removed from writing about the Crusades, you know.
It's interesting that Warcraft moved away from the idea that goblins are evil very quickly,
Hmm.
because they're evil, let's say in Warcraft 2. But then in World of Warcraft, like I said, they have their own society. They run the auction house. They're good to go. That you can play them as of
Hmm.
Cataclysm, and they're actually good creatures now. And they got rid of their own oppressive leader by themselves recently. So,
Yeah,
uh,
they're overthrowing the trolls, right? In Warcraft lore.
Well,
Uh,
that's how it was. But in recent lore, they actually got rid of. So they had an oppressive overlord who is now in the
oh, okay.
under in the Undermined, who is now gone, right? And so but they did it themselves, and they decided that no, we're not going to have a venture capitalist as our leader. We're going to run everything ourselves, right? And so they've done that as of recently as last year. So good for you, goblins. I wish my book, The Orc Who Saved Christmas, had been out before before you finished this book, because I wrote it a couple of
Yeah,
years ago. But we have a whole series about how the orc saves all of these holidays and teaches people about acceptance and
that's
inclusivity.
yeah,
Uh,
no, that's perfect. It's the same exact thing. I really like that. Yeah.
I want to read a last bit of your book, because the last chapter of your book is called Goblin Modes, as in there are many modes of goblins.
Hmm.
And you say the viral phenomena of Goblin Core and Goblin Mode use their titular inspiration as an avatar for two different kinds of resistance to social norms in the curated age of social media. Their popularity shows that the goblin, ugly, weird, peculiar, misunderstood, and ubiquitous, is widely perceived as a fitting creature to embody the appearances and behaviors outside the realm of the acceptable. To be a goblin is to be transgressive. To be transgressive is appropriate when societal expectations are so absurd. I love that piece so much.
Thank you.
I think it's great. Matt, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your goblins with us. What is something that you took away from this?
So the big takeaway, for me, it's something I touch on near the end of my conclusion, where I just kind of turn introspective, which is like I have been siloed for so long in this world of like medieval history. And that's like great, I guess. Like I don't know if it's great. It's a reality. It's the way that universities are built up, and I think it's just like the way that jobs t typically work, where it's like you become specialized and good at something, and so you learn more things about that, you read about that, and that furthers your specialization, right? And that is good, and I'm glad that we are able to like do those things. But I felt that my own like understanding of history and the cultures of the past was so enriched by looking far outside of what I knew virtually anything about. And so, like, this book, in writing it, encouraged me to not be complacent with like what I'm researching, what I'm reading, what I'm writing, and instead to try to venture outside of my comfort zone on a more regular basis. I've really enjoyed the works that I was able to encounter on like monster studies and disability studies, things that I are at best peripheral to what I've done before. And so my big takeaway is to like go outside of any sort of intellectual or practical comfort zones that you have, especially when thinking about just like the way that people think about the world, because it necessarily, I think, will broaden your own horizons in a productive way.
Goblins save lives and
Sure.
enrich your experience. A History of Goblins. If you're listening to this early, so it'll be out in Canada as of June 14th. It's already out as of May 19th worldwide. The History of Goblins by Matt King. Please go and buy it. It is really such a delight. If you are a big nerd like I am and you love D&D stuff and you love fantasy, I think this is definitely a must-have. Matt, thanks so much for everything. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Michelle.